Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your support is very important to us, so please subscribe. Go ahead and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from, and click the like button. All of this because the late afternoon sun was sinking low on the horizon as I made my way along the edge of our cornfield. It had been a long day of work on the farm, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. The breeze rustled through the tall stalks, creating a soothing whisper that almost lulled me into a false sense of security. Almost. I paused to wipe the sweat from my brow, leaning against the old wooden fence that separated the field from the dense forest beyond. That's when I felt it. A sudden chill that ran down my spine, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Something wasn't right. Slowly, I turned my head towards the tree line. My blood ran cold as I spotted a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, yellow-green and filled with an otherworldly intelligence that made my stomach churn. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. "Is someone there?" The only response was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. I took an involuntary step back, my heart beginning to race. As I watched, frozen in place, a massive shape began to emerge from the darkness between the trees. My breath caught in my throat as the creature stepped into the fading light. It was impossibly large, easily the size of a bear, but with the unmistakable form of a wolf. Its fur was matted and dark, covered in leaves and twigs as if it had been crashing through the underbrush. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed. Those same glowing orbs that had first caught my attention, now fixed upon me with predatory intensity. "This can't be real," I whispered to myself, blinking hard in the vain hope that the monster before me would disappear. But when I opened my eyes, it was still there, more solid and terrifying than ever. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as the beast took another step forward. I could see every detail with horrifying clarity, the way its muscles rippled beneath its shaggy coat, the glint of saliva on its exposed fangs, the steam rising from its nostrils in the cool evening air. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, to reconcile it with the world I thought I knew. The creature's head lowered, its massive shoulders hunching as if preparing to spring. My heart pounded so hard in my chest that I was sure it would burst. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there like a deer in headlights. But fear had me rooted to the spot, unable to move or even breathe. As if sensing my paralysis, the monster's lips curled back in a snarl, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth that gleamed in the dying light. A low, rumbling growl emanated from deep within its chest, growing in volume until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. "No," I managed to choke out, the word barely more than a whisper. "This isn't happening." But it was happening. With a bone-chilling howl that shattered the evening stillness, the creature lunged forward. Its powerful hind legs propelled it across the space between us with impossible speed, closing the distance in mere seconds. A scream caught in my throat, strangled by fear and disbelief. In that moment, survival instinct finally kicked in, overriding the paralyzing terror that had held me in place. I spun on my heel and ran. The cornfield loomed before me, a maze of green stalks that offered the only hope of escape. I plunged into it without hesitation, my arms outstretched to push aside the dense foliage. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the fence, wood splintering under its immense weight. "Help!" I screamed as I ran, though I knew there was no one around to hear me. The farmhouse was too far, and my voice was lost in the rustling of the corn and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I ran blindly, changing direction at random in hopes of losing my pursuer. Cornstalks whipped against my face, leaving stinging welts, but I barely noticed the pain. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and the monster at my heels. The sound of the creature's pursuit was terrifyingly close. I could hear its heavy breathing, the snap of stalks as it plowed through the field behind me. Each sound spurred me to run faster, pushing my body beyond what I thought possible. "This can't be happening," I gasped between ragged breaths. "Wolves don't get that big. It's not real. It can't be real." But the hot breath I felt on the back of my neck was all too real, as was the guttural growl that seemed to come from right beside me. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The beast was mere feet away, its glowing eyes fixed on me with murderous intent. I put on an extra burst of speed, my lungs burning with the effort. Ahead, I could see a break in the cornfield, the edge of the property where it gave way to open pasture. If I could just make it there, maybe I'd have a chance. With the last of my strength, I burst out of the cornfield. The sudden openness was disorienting after the claustrophobic press of the stalks. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but managed to keep running. That's when I saw it. The old tool shed at the far end of the pasture. It wasn't much, but it was the only shelter in sight. With renewed determination, I sprinted toward it, praying that its sturdy walls would be enough to keep the monster at bay. Behind me, I heard the creature explode out of the cornfield with a triumphant howl. The sound chilled me to my core, but I didn't dare look back. Every ounce of my being was focused on reaching that shed. As I neared the building, I could hear the rhythmic thud of the beast's paws on the ground, growing closer with each passing second. My hand reached out for the door handle, grasping at empty air once, twice before finally finding purchase. With strength born of desperation, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. The monster's snarling face filled the doorway for a split second before I slammed it shut, fumbling with trembling hands to slide the rusty bolt into place. No sooner had I secured the lock than the entire shed shook with the impact of the creature hurling itself against the door. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the far wall as the assault continued. Each thunderous blow made the timbers groan, and I was sure that at any moment the door would splinter and give way. But somehow, miraculously, it held. After what felt like an eternity, the pounding stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing and low, frustrated growls from outside. I slid down the wall, my legs finally giving out as the adrenaline began to ebb. My whole body shook uncontrollably as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Whatever that thing was out there, it wasn't natural. And as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside, I knew with grim certainty that my ordeal was far from over. The world had narrowed to a green blur of corn stalks and the thundering of my own heartbeat in my ears. I ran like I'd never run before, my feet pounding the earth in a desperate rhythm. The cool night air burned in my lungs as I gasped for breath, each intake feeling insufficient for the sheer effort I was exerting. Cornstalks whipped against my face as I sprinted through the field, leaving stinging welts across my cheeks and forehead. I was beyond caring about the pain. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and the monstrous creature pursuing me. I was deaf to everything but my own ragged breathing, the sound harsh and raspy in the stillness of the night. "Keep going," I wheezed to myself, pushing through the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. "Don't stop. Don't look back." But even as I urged myself onward, I could hear the creature's heavy footfalls behind me. The sound was getting closer with each passing second, a rhythmic thudding that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. The beast's breathing was audible now, too, deep guttural pants that spoke of raw animal power. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. In the dim moonlight filtering through the corn, I caught a glimpse of gleaming eyes and slavering jaws. The creature was massive, its form a dark blur of muscle and matted fur as it crashed through the stalks in pursuit. "This isn't happening," I gasped, turning my eyes forward again and redoubling my efforts to escape. "It can't be real. Things like this don't exist." But the hot breath I felt on the back of my neck was all too real, dispelling any notion that this was just some vivid nightmare. The monster was real, and it was gaining on me with every stride. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, knowing that slowing down meant certain death. I'd never considered myself out of shape, but now I cursed every skipped workout, every extra helping at dinner. My body was being pushed to its absolute limit, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could maintain this punishing pace. The cornfield seemed endless, a green maze with no exit in sight. I changed direction randomly, hoping to throw off my pursuer, but the sound of its pursuit never faltered. It was as if the creature could sense my every move, anticipating each turn before I made it. Suddenly, a howl pierced the night air, a sound so primal and terrifying that it sent chills down my spine. It was nothing like the wolves I'd heard on nature documentaries. This was deeper, more guttural, filled with a malevolence that seemed almost human in its intensity. The howl spurred me to run faster, drawing on reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. My feet barely seemed to touch the ground as I flew between the rows of corn, my arms pumping furiously at my sides. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was futile. The nearest farm was miles away, and even if someone heard me, who would believe what was happening? "Somebody, please." My cries were met only by another bone-chilling howl, closer this time. The creature was toying with me, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach. It could have caught me already if it wanted to. This was a game to it, a hunt, and I was nothing more than prey. As I ran, my mind raced almost as fast as my feet. What was this thing? Where had it come from? Why was this happening to me? But there were no answers, only the pounding of my heart and the rasping of my breath as I fought to stay alive. The moonlight suddenly grew brighter, and I realized I was nearing the edge of the cornfield. Hope surged within me. If I could just make it to open ground, maybe I'd have a better chance, maybe I could... My foot caught on something, a rock or a fallen branch, I couldn't tell, and I stumbled. For one heart-stopping moment I was falling, my arms windmilling as I fought to regain my balance. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as I teetered on the edge of disaster. "No, no, no," I gasped, my heart leaping into my throat as I nearly lost my footing entirely. By some miracle, I managed to stay upright, but the stumble had cost me precious seconds. I could feel the creature's breath hot on my neck now, could almost sense the snap of its jaws as it lunged for me. With a final burst of desperate energy, I burst out of the cornfield and into a small clearing. The sudden openness was disorienting after the claustrophobic press of the corn stalks. I blinked, my eyes struggling to adjust to the brighter moonlight. That's when I saw it, my old tool shed, standing like a sentinel at the far edge of the clearing. It wasn't much, just a ramshackle structure of weathered wood and rusted metal, but in that moment it looked like salvation. "Please," I wheezed, my legs feeling like lead as I forced them to keep moving. Just a little further. Behind me, I heard the creature explode out of the cornfield with a triumphant roar. The sound galvanized me, lending speed to my faltering steps. I crossed the clearing in what felt like slow motion, each second stretching into an eternity as I waited for the monster's claws to tear into my back. The shed loomed before me, growing larger with each stride. My hand reached out, grasping for the door handle. Once, twice. My fingers slipped off the rusty metal before finally finding purchase. With strength born of sheer terror, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. For a split second, I saw the creature's snarling face framed in the doorway, a vision of nightmarish proportions that I knew would haunt me forever. Then I slammed the door shut, my trembling hands scrabbling to slide the old bolt into place. No sooner had I secured the lock than the entire shed shook with the impact of the beast hurling itself against the door. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the far wall as the assault continued. Each thunderous blow made the timbers groan, and I was sure that at any moment the door would splinter and give way. "Go away!" I screamed, my voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "Leave me alone!" But the pounding continued, relentless and terrifying. I huddled in the corner, my eyes darting around the shed for anything I could use as a weapon. There was nothing, just empty shelves and a few rusted tools that looked like they'd crumble at a touch. As the night wore on, the attacks came in waves. Sometimes the creature would throw itself against the door and walls with such force that I was sure the whole structure would collapse. Other times there would be an eerie silence broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and low, menacing growls from outside. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking and praying for dawn. It felt like an eternity, each minute stretching out into hours as I waited for either rescue or doom. But somehow, miraculously, the shed held. And as the first hints of gray light began to seep through the cracks in the walls, the sounds of the creature faded away. I remained where I was, too terrified to move as the sun slowly rose. Only when the shed was fully illuminated by the morning light did I dare to stir, my body aching from the night's ordeal. As I contemplated what to do next, one thought echoed in my mind. This was far from over. Whatever that thing was, wherever it had gone, I knew with grim certainty that my brush with the impossible was only beginning. As I burst out of the cornfield, my legs burning and lungs heaving, I scanned the moonlit clearing in desperate hope. That's when I saw it, my old tool shed standing at the far edge, a dilapidated structure that had never looked more beautiful. Relief washed over me as I spotted this potential sanctuary from the terror behind me. "Please," I wheezed, forcing my exhausted body into a final sprint. "Just let me make it." The sound of the creature crashing through the corn spurred me on. I could almost feel its hot breath on my neck, hear the snap of its jaws as it lunged for me. But I was so close now, just a few more yards. I reached the shed and grabbed for the door handle. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely grip the rusty metal. Once, twice, my fingers slipped off, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. "Come on," I cried, panic rising in my throat as I heard the monster's growl growing closer. "Open, damn you!" On the third try, I managed to grasp the handle firmly. I yanked with all my might, praying the old latch would give way before the beast caught up. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed stuck fast. Then, with a screech of protesting metal, it finally opened. I threw myself inside, my momentum carrying me halfway across the small space. Spinning around, I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes and slavering jaws filling the doorway. With a strangled cry, I slammed the door shut, just as a heavy thud hit the other side. The entire structure shuddered with the impact, dust and debris raining down from the rafters. "Oh God," I gasped, fumbling in the darkness for the bolt. "Please hold." My fingers found the rusty metal and I slid it into place, just as another thunderous blow shook the shed. I scrambled backward until my back hit the far wall, pressing myself against the rough wood as if I could somehow meld into it. In the pitch blackness, I huddled in the corner, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. The creature's grunts and scratches outside were terrifyingly close, punctuated by occasional thuds as it hurled itself against the walls. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, squeezing my eyes shut, though it made no difference in the inky darkness. Things like this don't exist. It's not real. It can't be real. But the sounds outside were all too real, as was the acrid scent of fear that filled the small space. I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. Every creak of the wooden planks, every scrape of claws against the exterior, sent fresh waves of terror through me. Time lost all meaning in that lightless prison. Each minute felt like an eternity as I waited, hoping against hope that the flimsy walls would hold until dawn. The attacks came in waves, sometimes so violent I was sure the entire structure would collapse, other times fading to an eerie quiet broken only by low, menacing growls. During one of these lulls, I fumbled for my phone with trembling hands. The screen's sudden brightness was almost painful after the complete darkness. 2:17 a.m. Had it really only been a few hours since this nightmare began? I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course not. Why would anything go right tonight? I let out a strangled laugh that was closer to a sob, the hopelessness of my situation crashing down on me. As if sensing my despair, the creature renewed its assault with increased fury. The entire shed rocked on its foundation, and I heard the splintering of wood as claws tore into the exterior. "Go away," I screamed, my voice cracking. "Leave me alone." My cries only seemed to enrage the beast further. A particularly violent impact sent tools clattering from the walls. Something heavy, a hammer or wrench perhaps, struck my shoulder, drawing a pained yelp. I curled into a tighter ball, covering my head with my arms as more debris rained down. "Please," I whimpered, no longer sure if I was addressing the monster or some higher power. "Please, just let me live through this." The cacophony of destruction continued, each moment bringing me closer to certain doom. I was sure that any second, the walls would give way and those terrible jaws would close around me. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the end. But somehow, miraculously, the shed held. Gradually, the attacks began to lessen in intensity and frequency. By the time I dared to lift my head, the only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the occasional low growl from outside. I remained frozen in place, too terrified to move a muscle. My body ached from being held in such a tense position for so long, but I didn't dare shift. What if any movement on my part renewed the creature's frenzy? So I sat there, shaking and sweating in the stuffy darkness, as the night crawled by. Every so often, I'd hear a scratch or a snuffle from outside that would send my heart rate skyrocketing again. But the all-out assault seemed to have ended, at least for now. As the adrenaline began to ebb, exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. My eyelids felt like lead weights, and it took every ounce of willpower to keep them open. I knew that falling asleep could mean death, but my body was reaching its limits. To keep myself awake, I began to catalog my injuries in a whispered litany. Cuts on my face and arms from the corn, bruises everywhere from falling debris, shoulder aching where that tool hit me, muscles burning from running harder than I ever have in my life. It wasn't much, but focusing on the physical pain helped distract me from the soul-deep terror that threatened to overwhelm me. I also knew that when I got out of this, I'd need to be able to explain my condition. Not that anyone would believe the truth. I could barely believe it myself, and I was living through it. A hysterical giggle bubbled up in my throat at the thought of trying to explain this to the sheriff or a doctor. They'd think I was insane. Maybe I was. Maybe this was all some vivid hallucination brought on by stress or a brain tumor or something. It would almost be a relief if that were the case, but deep down I knew this was real. The pain was too sharp, the fear too visceral to be anything but reality. However impossible it seemed, there was a monster out there, a creature that by all rights shouldn't exist outside of myths and horror movies. As these thoughts chased themselves in circles through my mind, I gradually became aware of a change. The darkness inside the shed seemed less absolute, the shapes of tools and shelves becoming faintly visible. My heart leaped. Could it be? I fumbled for my phone again, wincing at the brightness of the screen. 5:43 a.m. Dawn was approaching. Hope surged within me, tempered by caution. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of the creature. There was only silence. But that didn't necessarily mean anything. It could be waiting just outside, ready to pounce the moment I let my guard down. I remained where I was, barely daring to breathe, as the light slowly grew stronger. Shafts of early morning sunlight began to penetrate the cracks in the walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Only when the shed was fully lit by the dawn did I dare to move, uncurling from my defensive position with a groan of pain. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I slowly stood, using the wall for support. I approached the door on shaky legs, pressing my ear against the rough wood. Nothing. No breathing. No growls. No scratching. Just the normal sounds of early morning, birdsong and a light breeze rustling through the corn. My hand hovered over the bolt, trembling violently. This was the moment of truth. If I opened that door, would I find safety or death waiting on the other side? Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself for whatever might come. It was time to face the light of day, and whatever it might reveal about the horrors of the night. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the old shed's walls, I found myself frozen in place, hand hovering over the rusted bolt. My heart pounded in my chest, a war between hope and terror raging within me. What if the creature was still out there, waiting? What if the moment I stepped outside would be my last? I pressed my ear against the rough wood of the door, straining to hear any sound of the monster's presence. Nothing but the gentle rustle of the breeze through the cornfield and the distant chirping of birds greeted me. It was so normal, so peaceful, that for a moment I wondered if the horrors of the night had all been some vivid nightmare. But the aches in my body and the scratches on my skin told a different story. This was real. All of it. Taking a deep breath, I slowly slid the bolt back. The metallic scrape seemed deafening in the morning quiet. I eased the door open a crack, cautiously peeking outside. The familiar landscape of my farm greeted me, bathed in the soft golden light of dawn. There was no sign of the monstrous creature that had hunted me through the night. My legs trembled as I stepped out of the shed, my eyes darting around, scanning the area for any hint of danger. The cornfield stood silent and still, showing no evidence of the frantic chase that had taken place just hours before. The clearing around the shed looked undisturbed, save for... I froze, a chill running down my spine. There, in a patch of soft mud near the shed, was a set of massive paw prints. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, too large for a wolf or dog, with deep impressions that spoke of incredible weight and power. "Oh God," I whispered, stumbling backward until my back hit the shed wall. It was real. It was all real. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had happened, struggling to accept the impossible. Werewolves didn't exist. They were the stuff of movies and campfire stories, not something that showed up on a quiet farm in rural America. And yet the evidence was right there in front of me, pressed into the mud. I approached the prints cautiously, as if they might suddenly come to life and attack. Up close, they were even more terrifying. I could see the imprint of massive claws at the end of each toe, easily as long as my fingers. Whatever had made these was no ordinary animal. "Think, damn it," I muttered to myself, running a shaky hand through my hair. What do I do now? The logical part of my brain said I should call for help, report the attack, get the authorities involved. But as I pulled out my phone with trembling hands, I hesitated. How could I possibly explain this? Who would believe me? I could imagine the conversation now. 911, what's your emergency? I was attacked last night. By a werewolf. I'm sorry, sir, did you say a werewolf? Yes, I know how it sounds, but... Sir, prank calling emergency services is a serious offense. I shook my head, banishing the imagined dialogue. No, calling 911 wasn't an option. Not yet, anyway. I needed evidence. Something more concrete than a few paw prints that could be explained away as belonging to a large dog or a bear. My gaze fell on the cornfield, and I felt a glimmer of hope. Surely there would be signs of the chase there. Broken stalks, more tracks, maybe even... I swallowed hard at the thought. Blood or fur. Something to prove that what happened was real. I approached the edge of the field cautiously, every sense on high alert. The cornstalks stood tall and undisturbed, showing no sign of the frantic path I'd carved through them the night before. Frowning, I pushed my way in, retracing what I thought was my route. Nothing. No broken stalks, no trampled ground, no sign that anything out of the ordinary had happened here. It was as if the field itself had healed overnight, erasing all evidence of the terror that had unfolded. "This is impossible," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the quiet morning air. It happened. I know it happened. But doubt was already creeping in, fed by the lack of evidence and the sheer impossibility of what I'd experienced. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? I made my way back to the clearing, my eyes drawn once again to the paw prints by the shed. They were still there, thank God. At least I wasn't completely crazy. But as I watched, a gust of wind blew across the clearing, sending a small whirlwind of loose dirt swirling over the tracks. By the time it passed, the prints were noticeably less distinct. Panic seized me. The evidence was literally disappearing before my eyes. Soon, there would be nothing left to prove that any of this had happened. I had to do something, preserve the proof somehow. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone again, this time opening the camera app. I knelt by the prints, trying to steady my trembling fingers enough to get a clear shot. The first few photos came out blurry, but finally I managed to capture a decent image of the massive paw print. As I stood, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The adrenaline that had kept me going was fading, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and a myriad of aches and pains. I looked down at myself, really taking stock of my condition for the first time. My clothes were torn and dirty, streaked with mud and what looked disturbingly like blood in places. Angry red welts crisscrossed my arms where the cornstalks had whipped against my skin. A particularly nasty gash on my forearm was still oozing blood. I need help, I realized, the words coming out in a hoarse whisper. Werewolf or no werewolf, I was injured and in shock. I needed medical attention. But as I raised my phone to make the call, another thought stopped me cold. What if it came back? The creature, whatever it was still out there somewhere. And night would fall again eventually. I couldn't stay here. My fingers hovered over the keypad as indecision paralyzed me. Call for help and risk being labeled insane? Or flee, abandoning everything I knew on the slim chance I could outrun a monster that might not even exist outside my own mind? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing, I knew I had to make a choice. Whatever I decided would shape everything that came after. With a deep breath, I steeled myself and began to dial, knowing that no matter what happened next, my life would never be the same. The sun had climbed higher in the sky by the time I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched the sheriff's patrol car pull up in front of my house. I'd been sitting on the porch steps, unable to bring myself to go inside, as if staying outdoors might somehow prove that the night's events weren't just a product of my imagination. Sheriff Dan Hawkins stepped out of the car, his deputy following close behind. I'd known Dan most of my life. He'd gone to high school with my older sister, but the look on his face as he approached was pure professional concern. "Morning, Jake," he called, his eyes scanning me from head to toe. "You're looking a bit rough. Want to tell me what happened?" I stood up, wincing at the protest from my battered body. "Dan, I don't even know where to start. You're not going to believe me." The sheriff's expression turned skeptical and my stomach sank. I hadn't even started my story and he was already doubting me. "Try me," he said, pulling out a notepad. Taking a deep breath, I launched into my account of the previous night's events. I described the creature I'd seen at the edge of the cornfield, the terrifying chase, and the long hours trapped in the shed. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief growing in both officers' eyes. "And when I came out this morning, there were these huge paw prints by the shed," I finished, my voice hoarse from the retelling. "I can show you, they're probably still there." Sheriff Hawkins exchanged a glance with his deputy before turning back to me. "Jake, I've known you a long time. You're not the type to make up stories or play pranks, but what you're describing, it's hard to swallow." Frustration bubbled up inside me. "I know how it sounds, Dan. Believe me, I do. But I'm telling you the truth. Something attacked me last night, and it wasn't any normal animal." The deputy, a younger man named Thompson, cleared his throat. "Mr. Holbrook, is it possible that you might have imagined some of this? Stress or fatigue can play tricks on the mind, especially in the dark." I felt my face flush with anger. "Imagined it? You think I did this to myself?" I gestured to my torn clothes and the cuts on my arms. That I spent the night huddled in a shed because I was tired? "Now, Jake, calm down," Sheriff Hawkins said, holding up a placating hand. "Nobody's accusing you of anything. We're just trying to understand what happened here." I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my temper. Getting angry wouldn't help my case. "Look, I know it sounds crazy, but I'm telling you, this thing was real. Come look at the prints, you'll see." I led them around to the shed, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. But as we rounded the corner, my blood ran cold. The clear, deep impressions I'd seen earlier were now little more than vague depressions in the mud. "No," I breathed, dropping to my knees beside the faint marks. They were here. They were clear as day just a couple hours ago. Sheriff Hawkins knelt beside me, studying the ground with a frown. These are some big tracks, I'll give you that. But Jake, this could easily be from a large dog, maybe a stray or even a coyote. My voice cracked as I insisted. It wasn't a dog, Dan. Or a coyote. This thing was huge. It was... I trailed off, the words, "a werewolf," dying in my throat. Saying it out loud would only make me sound crazier. "Jake," the sheriff said gently, standing up and brushing off his knees. "I believe that you believe something happened to you last night. But from what we can see here, there's no evidence of any kind of attack." Disappointment washed over me as I watched him gesture to his deputy. They conferred in low voices for a moment before turning back to me. "Here's what we're going to do," Sheriff Hawkins said. "We'll increase patrols in the area for the next few nights, keep an eye out for any large animals. In the meantime, I want you to get some rest. You look like you've been through hell." I nodded numbly, knowing that arguing further would be pointless. They didn't believe me. How could they, when even I was starting to doubt my own memories? "If you remember anything else, or if you see anything suspicious, you call us right away," the sheriff continued. "And Jake? Maybe consider talking to someone. Dr. Patel in town is good if you need someone to process things with." I bristled at the implication that I needed psychological help, but bit back a retort. "Thanks, Dan. I'll keep that in mind." As I watched the patrol car drive away, a profound sense of loneliness settled over me. The officers had listened to my story, seen the state I was in, and still dismissed it all as a product of my wild imagination. I was on my own. I turned back towards the house, my gaze sweeping across the peaceful farm. Everything looked so normal in the bright morning light. The cornfield swayed gently in the breeze, birds chirped in the nearby trees, and in the distance, I could hear the low mooing of cattle from a neighboring farm. How could something so terrifying have happened in such an ordinary place? And if it had really happened, where was the evidence? The creature had left no trace beyond those rapidly fading paw prints and the wounds on my body. As I climbed the porch steps, a new, chilling thought occurred to me. Night would fall again in just a few hours. What if the creature came back? The shed had barely held up to its assault last night. Would my house fare any better? I paused at the door, my hand on the knob. Part of me wanted to run, to get in my truck and drive as far away as possible. But where would I go? Who would believe me? With a heavy sigh, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. As I moved through the familiar rooms, I found myself checking the locks on every window, drawing curtains closed and gathering anything that could serve as a weapon. "You're being paranoid," I muttered to myself as I placed a kitchen knife on my bedside table. But the memory of glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth was too fresh, the fear too real to ignore. As I finally allowed myself to sink onto my bed, exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. My entire body ached, and my mind felt foggy from lack of sleep. But even as my eyelids grew heavy, I fought to stay awake. What if I closed my eyes only to open them and find those terrifying jaws lunging for my throat? What if all of this, the morning, the sheriff's visit, was just a dream, and I was still trapped in that nightmare? I reached for my phone, pulling up the photo I'd taken of the paw print. It was blurry and indistinct, nothing like the clear evidence I'd hoped for. But it was something, proof, however small, that I wasn't completely insane. As I stared at the image, my mind raced with questions. What was that creature? Where had it come from? And most importantly, what would I do when night fell again? With the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me, I settled in for a long, anxious wait for sunset, knowing that whatever happened next, I was facing it alone. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as I stood at the edge of the cornfield, my body tense and my senses on high alert. Despite the sheriff's dismissal and my own exhaustion, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to find proof of what had happened. Determination pushed me forward as I steeled myself to comb through the field one last time. There has to be something. I muttered, pushing aside the first row of corn stalks. Anything. The rustling of the corn in the breeze sent shivers down my spine, reminding me all too vividly of the creature's pursuit. But I pressed on, scanning the ground and the plants around me for any sign of disturbance. For what felt like hours, I found nothing. The cornfield seemed untouched, as if the frantic chase had never happened. Doubt began to creep in, whispering that maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the sheriff was right and stress had played tricks on my mind. Just as I was about to give up, something caught my eye. There, snagged on a broken cornstalk, was a tuft of coarse, dark fur. My heart raced as I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to disappear like a mirage. But it was real. Coarse and wiry, unlike any animal fur I'd ever felt before. With shaking hands, I carefully removed it from the stalk and placed it in a small plastic bag I'd brought for evidence. I knew it, I whispered, a mixture of relief and fear washing over me. I'm not crazy. Energized by the discovery, I pushed deeper into the field. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for any other signs of the creature's passage. That's when the smell hit me, a sickly sweet odor of decay that made my stomach churn. Following the scent, I pushed through a particularly dense patch of corn. What I saw on the other side made me stumble back, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. There, in a small clearing, lay the mangled remains of a deer. Its body was torn apart in a way that defied explanation. The wounds were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, not the clean cuts of a hunter, or the typical marks left by local predators. "Oh God," I choked out, fighting the urge to vomit. The deer's ribcage had been ripped open, its internal organs scattered around the clearing. Deep gashes scored its flanks, and its head was nearly severed from its body. As I forced myself to look closer, I noticed something even more disturbing. The wounds didn't look fresh. In fact, they seemed to be several days old, despite the fact that I knew this area had been cleared just yesterday. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to take photos of the scene. I knew I needed proof to convince others, but part of me dreaded having to look at these images again. "Focus," I told myself, trying to steady my hands enough to get clear shots. "This is what you were looking for, evidence." As I documented the grisly scene, my mind raced with questions. How had the creature taken down a full-grown deer so easily? Why did the wounds look older than they should? And most importantly, what would happen if it turned its attention to humans again? I was so absorbed in my investigation that I almost didn't notice the changing light. It wasn't until I looked up from my phone that I realized how low the sun had sunk in the sky. Dread settled in my stomach as I realized I was still out in the open, and night was rapidly approaching. "Shit," I hissed, quickly pocketing my phone and the bag with the fur sample. I needed to get back to the house, and fast. As I turned to leave, a rustling sound from deeper in the cornfield froze me in place. It was probably just the wind, I told myself. But the memory of glowing eyes and snapping jaws was too fresh to ignore. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd heard the noise. The cornstalk swayed gently, revealing nothing but deepening shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. If there was something out there, I'd just given away my position. No response came, but the silence felt heavier somehow, more ominous. I turned and began to walk quickly towards the edge of the field, fighting the urge to break into a run. Running had only excited the creature last night. If it was out there again, I didn't want to trigger its predatory instincts. The journey back seemed to take an eternity. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot sent my heart racing. By the time I broke free of the cornfield, the sun was a mere sliver on the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. I jogged the last few yards to my house, slamming the door behind me and engaging every lock. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, slumping against the wall as the adrenaline began to fade. "What now?" I asked the empty room, running a shaky hand through my hair. I had evidence now. The fur, the photos. But would it be enough? And more pressingly, what was I going to do about tonight? The creature was still out there, and I had a sinking feeling it wasn't done with me yet. As darkness fell outside my windows, I found myself moving through the house, double-checking locks and drawing curtains. I gathered supplies, food, water, a flashlight, my phone charger, and barricaded myself in the bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at the phone in my hand. Should I call someone? The sheriff again? He hadn't believed me before, but maybe with this new evidence. Before I could decide, a long, mournful howl shattered the evening quiet. It was distant, but unmistakable, and utterly inhuman. My blood ran cold as I realized that the nightmare was far from over. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when I found myself racing back to the house, my heart pounding in my chest. Every rustle in the cornfield, every shifting shadow in the growing darkness, sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me, tracking my every move. As I reached the porch, fumbling with my keys, a sound froze me in place. A howl echoed across the fields, so deep and menacing it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't the yip of a coyote or even the howl of a normal wolf. This was something else entirely. "It's back," I whispered, my voice trembling as I finally managed to unlock the door and stumble inside. I slammed the door shut behind me, engaging every lock and shoving a chair under the doorknob for good measure. My hands shook as I drew the curtains closed, plunging the living room into near total darkness. "Okay, think," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my racing thoughts. "You've got food, water, a phone. You just need to make it through the night." I moved through the house, checking windows and gathering supplies. Just as I was heading upstairs to barricade myself in the bedroom, a loud pop from outside made me jump. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. "No, no, no," I hissed, fumbling for the flashlight I'd thankfully grabbed earlier. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the now silent house. This can't be happening. I tried the light switches, but nothing happened. The power was well and truly out. My mind raced with possibilities. Had the creature somehow cut the power? Or was this just horrible timing? A loud thump from outside interrupted my panicked thoughts. Then another, and another. Heavy footsteps circling the house. My breath caught in my throat as a low, guttural growl joined the footsteps. "It's out there," I whispered, pressing myself against the wall next to a window. "It knows I'm in here." The footsteps paused, and for a moment all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice, the slow scrape of claws against the side of the house. I bit back a whimper, sliding down the wall until I was crouched on the floor. The beam of my flashlight danced wildly as my hands shook. I wanted to turn it off, to hide in the darkness, but the thought of being blind to whatever was out there was even more terrifying. The scraping moved along the wall, accompanied by snuffling sounds. It was searching, I realized, searching for a way in. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was pleading with. "Please just go away." As if in answer to my prayer, the sounds suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noises had been. I strained my ears, trying to determine if the creature had left or if it was just waiting. Minutes ticked by, each feeling like an eternity. Slowly, cautiously, I rose to my feet. I had to know if it was still out there. With trembling hands, I reached for the curtain, pulling it back just enough to peer out. What I saw made my heart stop. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a massive silhouette. It stood on two legs, but its proportions were all wrong for a human. Its shoulders were too broad, its arms too long, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. Two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce right through me. For a moment we stared at each other through the glass. Then, with a snarl that I felt more than heard, it lunged at the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with my car keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp them. The creature's howl echoed through the night, sending chills down my spine. I knew I had mere seconds before it would be upon me. I burst through the door into the garage, slamming it shut behind me. The sound of splintering wood told me it wouldn't hold for long. I scrambled into my car, jamming the key into the ignition with trembling fingers. "Come on, come on," I pleaded as the engine sputtered to life. Just then, an ear-splitting crash reverberated through the garage. In my rearview mirror, I saw the door explode inward, and a mass of fur and muscle burst through the opening. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, glowing with an otherworldly hunger. Its muzzle pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. This was no ordinary wolf. It was something out of a nightmare. I slammed the car into reverse, my foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. The tires squealed against the concrete as I shot backward. The beast lunged, its claws raking across the hood of my car with a horrific screech of tearing metal. My heart leaped into my throat as I felt the impact. For a terrifying moment, I thought the creature had made it inside the vehicle. But as I careened out of the garage and onto the driveway, I realized it had just missed me. I threw the car into drive, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The country road stretched out before me, a ribbon of darkness illuminated only by my headlights. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, willing the car to go faster. In the rearview mirror, I could see the monster giving chase. Its massive form ate up the ground with impossible speed, closing the distance between us with each bound. I had never seen anything move so quickly. "This can't be happening," I muttered to myself, my voice cracking with fear. "This can't be real." But the pounding of my heart and the sweat trickling down my back told me this was all too real. I swerved around a bend in the road, praying I could maintain control of the vehicle at this speed. Suddenly, a dark shape hurtled through the air, landing with a thunderous impact on the hood of my car. I screamed as the metal buckled beneath the creature's weight. Its hideous face filled my windshield, jaws snapping mere inches from the glass. I jerked the wheel hard to the left, then right, trying to shake the beast off. But it clung on with terrifying strength, its claws digging deep furrows into the metal. "Get off!" I shouted, though I knew the creature couldn't understand me. It was driven by pure animalistic instinct, and right now that instinct was to tear me apart. The road ahead curved sharply. In a moment of desperation, I made a split-second decision. Instead of following the curve, I drove straight ahead, plowing through the underbrush at the side of the road. The car bounced violently as we left the pavement, branches whipping against the windshield. The jarring motion seemed to surprise the creature. For a brief moment, its grip loosened. Seizing the opportunity, I slammed on the brakes. The sudden deceleration sent the beast flying forward, tumbling off the hood and into the darkness ahead. Without hesitation, I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning in the soft earth before finding purchase. I backed onto the road, then shifted into drive once more, my engine roaring as I accelerated away from the scene. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sped down the country road, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of pursuit. But the night behind me remained empty. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the pain set in. My whole body ached from the violent motions of the escape. I could feel warm wetness on my forehead. At some point, I must have hit my head on the steering wheel. I drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Every shadow on the roadside made me flinch, expecting the creature to leap out at any moment. But gradually, the rural landscape gave way to more populated areas. Streetlights began to appear, and soon I found myself entering the outskirts of town. Only then did I allow myself to slow down, my breathing finally starting to normalize. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, its neon sign a beacon of normalcy in the surreal nightmare I had just experienced. I sat there for a long moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. The events of the night replayed in my mind, each detail more unbelievable than the last. How could I possibly explain this to anyone? With shaking hands, I reached up to examine the cut on my forehead. It wasn't deep, but it was still bleeding. I knew I should seek medical attention, but the thought of trying to explain what had happened filled me with dread. Who would believe me? A werewolf attack in the 21st century? They'd think I was crazy or worse, on drugs. But I knew what I had seen. The creature's snarling face was burned into my memory, its inhuman eyes haunting me every time I closed my own. I glanced at my car, wincing at the damage. Deep claw marks scored the hood, and the metal was buckled where the creature had landed. It looked like I had driven through a war zone. How would I explain this to my insurance company? To the police? The absurdity of the situation almost made me laugh, but the sound caught in my throat, turning into something closer to a sob. I needed help. That much was clear. But more than that, I needed someone to believe me. As I sat there in the harsh fluorescent light of the diner's parking lot, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. The weight of what had happened began to settle on me. I had narrowly escaped death at the hands, or rather, claws, of a creature that shouldn't exist. The world as I knew it had been turned upside down in the span of a single night. What would I do now? Where could I go? The thought of returning to my house, of facing that dark country road again, filled me with paralyzing fear. But I couldn't just sit here forever. With a deep breath, I forced myself to focus on the immediate future. First, I needed to take care of this head wound. Then somehow I would have to figure out how to report what had happened without sounding like a lunatic. As I reached for the door handle, preparing to enter the diner and ask for a first aid kit, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made me freeze. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the darkness beyond the parking lot. But when I whipped my head around to look, there was nothing there, just shadows and the gentle rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Still, as I stepped out of the car on shaky legs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. Whatever that creature was, wherever it had come from, I had a sinking feeling that our paths would cross again. For now, though, I was alive. I had escaped. And as I walked towards the diner's welcoming lights, I clung to that small victory. Knowing it might be all that would keep me sane in the days to come, the world seemed to slow down as I watched the creature's massive paw crash through my windshield. The sound of shattering glass filled my ears, mixing with my own terrified scream. Shards rained down on me, stinging my face and arms as I desperately tried to keep the car on the road. The beast's foul breath washed over me, hot and rank with the smell of decay. Its eyes, mere inches from my face, burned with an inhuman hunger that chilled me to my core. This was no animal. This was a monster straight out of humanity's darkest nightmares. Oh God, I whimpered, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as the car swerved violently. The road ahead blurred through my tears and the spiderweb cracks spreading across what remained of the windshield. I could hear the creature's claws scrabbling for purchase on the hood of the car, the screech of tearing metal cutting through the night. Its massive form blocked most of my view, forcing me to drive almost blind down the winding country road. Suddenly, a searing pain tore through my left arm. I screamed as the monster's claws raked across my skin, drawing blood. The warm wetness spreading down my arm told me the wound was deep. "Get off!" I shrieked, more in desperation than any hope the creature would understand. "Leave me alone!" But the beast only snarled in response, its jaws snapping inches from my face. I could see every detail of its nightmarish visage, the elongated snout, the razor-sharp teeth, the inhuman intelligence burning in its eyes. This was no ordinary wolf. This was something else entirely. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. The trees lining the road whipped past in a dark blur. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Either I'd crash, or the creature would break through and tear me apart. In that moment of clarity, a plan formed in my panic-stricken mind. It was desperate, probably suicidal, but it was all I had. Taking a deep breath, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry," I whispered to my car, knowing what I was about to do would likely destroy it. Then, with all the strength I could muster, I slammed on the brakes. The world lurched violently. The creature, caught off guard, lost its grip on the hood. I watched in a mixture of terror and awe as its massive form went airborne, flying over the car in a tangle of fur and limbs. The beast hit the road behind me with a sickening thud, rolling several times before coming to a stop. For a heart-stopping moment, it lay still, and I dared to hope it was over. But then it stirred. Panic surged through me anew as I watched the creature slowly rise to its feet in my rearview mirror. It shook itself, as if shrugging off the impact, then fixed its glowing eyes on my car once more. No, 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 I muttered, fumbling with the gear shift. My injured arm screamed in protest as I threw the car into drive, but I ignored the pain. Nothing mattered now except getting away. The engine roared as I floored the accelerator, tires squealing against the asphalt. In my mirror, I could see the beast giving chase, eating up the distance between us with impossible speed. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed the car to its limits, taking the curves of the country road at speeds that threatened to send us careening off into the woods. But the alternative, being caught by that monster, was unthinkable. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, I drove like a person possessed. Every shadow on the roadside made me flinch, expecting the creature to leap out at any moment. But gradually the rural landscape began to give way to more populated areas. Streetlights appeared, then houses, then the outskirts of town. Only when I found myself on a well-lit suburban street did I dare to slow down. My breathing came in ragged gasps as I scanned the road behind me, searching for any sign of pursuit. But there was nothing, just an empty street stretching back into darkness. Relief washed over me, so intense it was almost painful. I was alive. I had escaped. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. For a long moment I just sat there, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. What the hell was that thing? I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. As if in answer, a sharp pain lanced through my arm, reminding me of the creature's attack. I looked down to see my sleeve soaked with blood, 4 deep gashes clearly visible through the torn fabric. The sight of the wound brought everything crashing back. The terror, the impossible nature of what I'd just experienced, the horrifying realization that the world was not as I'd always believed it to be. I needed help. I needed medical attention for my arm, and... what? Who could I possibly tell about this? Who would believe me? With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I waited for someone to answer, I stared out into the night, half expecting to see those glowing eyes emerge from the darkness once more. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly explain what had happened? I've been attacked, I finally managed to say. I'm injured. I need help. Okay, sir, can you tell me where you are? The dispatcher asked. I gave her my location as best I could, describing the street and nearby landmarks. All right, I'm sending an ambulance to your location now, she said. Can you tell me more about the attack? Who attacked you? I hesitated, my mind racing. The truth would sound insane. They'd think I was crazy or on drugs, but I couldn't lie, not about this. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, I said, my voice breaking. It wasn't human. It was something else, something impossible. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When the dispatcher spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. Sir, are you safe now? Is your attacker still in the area? No, I don't think so, I replied, scanning the street once more. I got away. I'm in my car. Okay, that's good. The ambulance is on its way. Can you stay on the line with me until they arrive? I nodded, then remembered she couldn't see me. Yes, I can do that. As I waited for help to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had irrevocably changed. The creature was gone, disappeared into the night without a trace. But the memory of its savage attack, the inhuman hunger in its eyes, would stay with me forever. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, werewolf, monster, or something else entirely, it was still out there. And somehow, I doubted it was done with me yet. As the distant wail of sirens reached my ears, I steeled myself for what was to come. I had survived the attack, but now I faced a different kind of challenge. How could I make anyone believe what I had seen? And more importantly, how could I protect myself and others from a threat that shouldn't even exist? The ambulance rounded the corner, its flashing lights illuminating the night. As the paramedics approached my battered car, I took a deep breath. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room seemed to bore into my skull, intensifying the pounding headache that had set in. I sat on the edge of an examination table, my torn and bloodied shirt discarded beside me, as a doctor carefully cleaned and dressed the deep gashes on my arm. "These are some nasty lacerations," the doctor murmured, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You said this was from an animal attack?" I nodded, wincing as he applied antiseptic to the wounds. "Yes, but it wasn't an ordinary animal." The doctor glanced up at me, his expression a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "What do you mean by that?" I took a deep breath, knowing how insane I was about to sound. "It was larger than any wolf I've ever seen, and it stood on its hind legs. It was like a werewolf." The doctor's hands paused for a moment, and he exchanged a glance with the nurse assisting him. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "I see. And where did this encounter take place?" "On the road near my house," I replied, my frustration growing. I could see the disbelief in their eyes. "Look, I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you the truth. This thing attacked my car, smashed through the windshield. It wasn't a normal animal." The nurse placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You've been through a traumatic experience," she said softly. "Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us when we're scared." I shrugged off her hand, anger flaring within me. "I'm not crazy," I snapped. "I know what I saw." The doctor finished bandaging my arm and stepped back. "No one's saying you're crazy," he said in a placating tone. "But perhaps it would be helpful to speak with someone about what you've been through. We have excellent counselors here at the hospital." "I don't need a counselor," I interrupted. "I need someone to believe me, to do something about this thing that's out there." The doctor sighed, removing his gloves. "Mister, your name? We've treated your injuries, but I'm concerned about your mental state. I'd like to keep you here for observation just for tonight." "No," I said firmly, standing up despite the wave of dizziness that washed over me. "I'm going home. You can't keep me here against my will." After a brief argument and signing a stack of forms acknowledging that I was leaving against medical advice, I found myself in the hospital parking lot, the cool night air a stark contrast to the sterile environment I'd just left. As I waited for my taxi, I pulled out my phone, a spark of hope igniting within me. I'd taken photos of the creature, hadn't I? Surely that would be enough to convince them. But as I scrolled through my camera roll, my heart sank. The images were there, but they were nothing more than blurry streaks of darkness and motion. In the heat of the moment, with my hands shaking from fear and adrenaline, I'd failed to capture anything recognizable. The taxi ride home was a blur of conflicting emotions. Relief at having survived, frustration at not being believed, and a gnawing fear of what might still be out there. As we pulled up to my house, I half expected to see it in ruins, evidence of the night's events strewn across the lawn. But everything looked normal, peaceful even, in the soft glow of the porch light. I paid the driver and stumbled up the path, my body aching with every step. Inside, I leaned against the closed door, surveying my living room. There was no sign of the frantic escape I'd made earlier, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a nightmare, that I'd wake up tomorrow and find it had never happened. But the throbbing pain in my arm and the tattered remains of my shirt were stark reminders of the reality I'd faced. Exhaustion suddenly hit me like a physical force. I barely managed to drag myself to the bedroom, collapsing onto the bed without even changing my clothes. But sleep, when it came, was far from restful. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window jolted me awake. In the darkness, shadows seemed to move and shift, taking on monstrous forms. At one point, a howl echoed in the distance. Probably just a regular wolf or a coyote, but in my heightened state of fear, it sounded all too familiar. I buried my head under the pillow, trying to block out the sound and the terrifying memories it evoked. As the first light of dawn began to filter through my curtains, I gave up on sleep entirely. I sat up in bed, rubbing my bleary eyes, feeling as though I hadn't rested at all. The events of the past night replayed in my mind, each detail more unbelievable than the last. How could I possibly move forward from this? Who could I turn to? The doctors thought I was delusional, and I couldn't blame them. If someone had told me this story a day ago, I wouldn't have believed it either. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. That creature, that werewolf, for lack of a better term, was real, and it was still out there somewhere. As I forced myself out of bed and stumbled to the bathroom, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, and my face was pale and drawn. I looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or something far worse. The bandages on my arm stood out starkly against my skin, a visceral reminder that this was no dream or hallucination. Those wounds were real, and they would leave scars, both physical and mental. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the lingering fog of fear and exhaustion. As I dried off, a realization hit me. I couldn't just ignore this and hope it would go away. That thing was still out there, and who knew when it might attack again. Next time, the victim might not be lucky enough to escape. But what could I do? The authorities wouldn't believe me. I had no proof, no evidence beyond my own testimony and some blurry, useless photos. As I made my way to the kitchen to brew a much-needed pot of coffee, my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe I could set up cameras around the area where I'd first seen the creature. Or perhaps there were others out there who had similar experiences. I could search online, reach out to them. One thing was certain. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Somewhere out there, a monster roamed free, and I seemed to be the only one who knew about it. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on my shoulders as I sipped my coffee, staring out the window at the deceptively peaceful morning. I didn't know what my next move would be, but I knew I had to do something. Because if I didn't, who would? And how many more people might fall victim to a threat they didn't even know existed? With that grim thought, I set down my coffee mug and headed to my computer. It was time to start researching, to find out everything I could about werewolves and similar creatures. I might be alone in my knowledge of the beast's existence, but I was determined not to be unprepared if, or more likely when, our paths crossed again. The crisp autumn air bit at my skin as I hauled my backpack out of the truck. I'd driven for hours to reach this remote spot in the Colorado wilderness, far from the usual tourist trails. The solitude was exactly what I needed after months of grinding at my desk job in Denver. As I began to set up camp, the fading sunlight painted the surrounding pines in hues of orange and gold. The beauty of it all almost made me forget the chill seeping through my jacket. Almost. Should have packed that extra sweater, I muttered to myself, rubbing my arms vigorously. I worked quickly to pitch my tent, knowing darkness would soon be upon me. The familiar routine of threading poles and hammering stakes into the ground helped calm my nerves. I'd been camping alone before, but something about this place felt different. Just as I was finishing up, a distant howl echoed through the trees. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding. The sound was haunting, primal, and much closer than I'd expected to hear any wolves. "It's fine," I reassured myself aloud, my voice sounding small in the vast wilderness. "Wolves don't attack people. They're more afraid of you than you are of them." But as I gathered firewood, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves made me whip around, searching the deepening shadows. By the time I had a decent pile of wood, my nerves were frayed. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a faint glow in the western sky. I hurried to get a fire going, grateful for the warmth and light as flames licked up from my carefully arranged tinder. As full darkness settled in, I heated up some canned soup over the fire. The familiar task should have been comforting, but I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. "You're being ridiculous," I chided myself between spoonfuls of lukewarm soup. "This is why you came out here, to get away from it all and relax." But relaxation seemed impossible. The crackling campfire did little to ease my growing unease as the night wore on. Every pop and hiss from the burning wood made me flinch. Shadows danced at the edge of the firelight, playing tricks on my eyes. More than once, I could have sworn I saw a large shape moving just beyond the illuminated circle. I tried to distract myself by going over my plans for the next day's hike. There was a beautiful vista about 5 miles up the trail that I was eager to photograph, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that lone wolf howl and the prickling sensation of unseen eyes upon me. "Enough of this," I said firmly, standing up and stretching. "Time to turn in. Things will look better in the morning." I doused the fire, plunging the campsite into darkness broken only by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees. As my eyes adjusted, I fumbled for my flashlight, eager to retreat to the relative safety of my tent. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping nearby, much too close for comfort. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound had come from just beyond where my fire had been, no more than 15 feet away. Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. I swept my flashlight beam in a wide arc, searching for the source of the noise. The trees stood like silent sentinels, revealing nothing. Another snap, this time to my left. I spun, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the light. Yellow, predatory eyes far larger than any wolf's should be. "Oh God," I whispered, stumbling backward toward my tent. My hands shook as I fumbled with the zipper, desperate to get inside. Once in, I zipped the tent closed and huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Outside, I could hear something moving. Heavy footsteps circled my tent, accompanied by deep, rumbling breaths that no human could produce. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as whatever it was prowled around my campsite. Hours seemed to pass, though my watch told me it had only been about 45 minutes. Eventually, the sounds faded, leaving me alone with the regular nighttime noises of the forest. Sleep was impossible. Every time I started to drift off, a new sound would jerk me back to full alertness. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, I realized with a start that I'd been awake all night. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The campsite looked undisturbed. There were no tracks, no signs of the massive creature I'd been certain was out there. Had it all been in my imagination? As I emerged from the tent on shaky legs, a glint of yellow caught my eye. There, snagged on a nearby bush, was a tuft of coarse dark fur, far too large to belong to any normal wolf. I stared at it, my mind reeling. What I'd experienced last night, it couldn't be real, could it? Wolves didn't grow to the size I'd glimpsed in that fleeting moment. And yet, the fear I'd felt had been all too real. My gaze drifted to the hiking trail that led deeper into the wilderness. The vista I'd planned to visit suddenly held no appeal. All I wanted now was to get back to civilization, back to a world that made sense. With trembling hands, I began to break down my camp. Every few seconds, I'd stop to scan the surrounding forest, half expecting to see those yellow eyes watching me from the shadows. The peaceful solitude I'd sought now felt oppressive, threatening. As I loaded the last of my gear into the truck, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, heart in my throat, to see a park ranger's vehicle pulling up beside me. The ranger, a friendly-looking woman in her 50s, stepped out with a wave. "Morning, camper. Everything okay here? You're packing up awful early." I hesitated, glancing back at the woods. Should I tell her what I'd experienced? Would she even believe me? The fur I'd found was gone. Had I imagined that too? I'm fine, I managed, forcing a smile. Just didn't sleep well. Think I'll head back to town? She nodded sympathetically. The wilderness isn't for everyone. You drive safe now. As I climbed into my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake by not saying anything. But what could I say? That I thought a monster had stalked my campsite all night? I started the engine, stealing one last look at the tree line. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw something large move between the trunks, melting into the shadows. Shaking my head, I put the truck in gear. Whatever had happened last night, real or imagined, I needed to put some distance between myself and these woods. As I pulled onto the main road, I made a silent vow never to go camping alone again. Little did I know my ordeal was far from over. The events of that night would continue to haunt me, leading to an encounter that would change my life forever. I couldn't sleep. How could I after what I'd experienced earlier? The eerie sounds, the feeling of being watched, that tuft of fur I'd found, and then lost. It all swirled in my mind, keeping me wide awake despite my exhaustion. I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the tent ceiling. The pale moonlight filtering through the fabric cast everything in an otherworldly glow. Every rustle of leaves outside made me flinch. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but a gnawing fear in my gut told me otherwise. Get it together, I whispered to myself, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. There's nothing out there. You're letting your imagination run wild. But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Something was out there. Something that shouldn't exist. A twig snapped nearby, much closer than before. I bolted upright, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap, just enough to peer out. That's when I saw them. Yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, reflecting the moonlight like twin flames. They were far too large, too intelligent to be a normal wolf. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the eyes were fixed directly on me. Oh God, I breathed, unable to look away. This isn't happening. But it was happening. As I watched, frozen in terror, an enormous fur-covered silhouette emerged from the tree line. It moved with an unnatural grace, each step deliberate and predatory. In the dim light, I could make out a vaguely humanoid shape, but twisted, elongated. Massive shoulders hunched forward, arms ending in what could only be described as claws. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Werewolves didn't exist. They were the stuff of movies and campfire stories, not something you encountered in the Colorado wilderness. The creature paused at the edge of my campsite, its head tilting as it regarded me. Then, it opened its mouth, revealing rows of gleaming fangs, and let out a growl that vibrated through my chest. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Part wolf, part something else entirely. It paralyzed me with fear, rooting me to the spot. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. Me, a terrified camper who suddenly felt very, very small. And it, a monster straight out of my worst nightmares. Then, as if a spell had been broken, survival instinct kicked in. I scrambled backward, my hands frantically searching for the tent zipper. I had to get out, had to run, had to do something. Come on, I muttered, fingers fumbling with the zipper. It felt like trying to thread a needle while wearing oven mitts. Outside, I heard heavy footsteps approaching. Each thud sent a jolt of terror through me. It was coming closer, and I was trapped in a nylon cocoon. Finally, the zipper gave way. I burst out of the tent, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste. The cool night air hit my face as I straightened up, ready to run. But I wasn't fast enough. A massive shape loomed over me, blocking out the moonlight. I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes, a flash of teeth, and then pain exploded across my back as claws tore through my jacket. I screamed, more from shock than pain, and lurched forward. My feet found purchase on the forest floor, and I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I heard the creature give chase. Its growls filled the air, spurring me to even greater speed. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and compress, each second lasting an eternity, yet passing in a blur. All I knew was the pounding of my heart, the rasping of my breath, and the terrifying sounds of pursuit. Suddenly, the trees thinned, and I burst into a small clearing. In the center stood an old cabin, its weathered boards barely visible in the moonlight. Without thinking, I made a beeline for it. The door hung crookedly on its hinges. I slammed into it shoulder first, tumbling inside. Scrambling to my feet, I turned and threw my weight against the door, forcing it shut. For a moment, all I could do was lean against the door, gasping for breath. My back stung where the creature's claws had caught me, and I could feel warm wetness seeping through my torn jacket. A horrific howl split the night, so close it made me jump. Something heavy slammed against the door, nearly knocking me off my feet. I braced myself against it, knowing that if the creature got in, I was done for. "Go away," I whimpered, tears streaming down my face. "Please, just go away." But it didn't go away. For what felt like hours, the creature circled the cabin, sometimes throwing itself against the walls or door, other times just growling low and menacing. I huddled in a corner, jumping at every sound, certain that at any moment the rotting wood would give way and I'd come face to face with those terrible yellow eyes again. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the walls, the attacks finally ceased. The forest fell silent, save for the normal sounds of birds awakening. I didn't move for a long time, too afraid to believe it was really over. When I finally gathered the courage to peer out a grimy window, the clearing was empty. No massive beast, no glowing eyes. Just an ordinary forest scene in the early morning light. Gingerly, I felt at my back. My jacket was shredded, and beneath it I could feel 4 parallel gashes. They stung, but didn't seem too deep. I'd been lucky, if you could call any of this luck. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit me like a truck. I slumped to the floor, my mind spinning. What had happened last night? What was that thing? And most importantly, what was I going to do now? I knew I needed to get back to civilization, to safety. But the thought of stepping outside, of potentially coming face to face with that creature again, filled me with dread. Just wait a little longer, I told myself, hugging my knees to my chest. Give it time to get far away. So I sat there in that dusty old cabin, listening to the forest wake up around me, waiting, hoping and wondering how I was going to explain any of this to anyone without sounding completely insane. Little did I know my ordeal was far from over. The first rays of sunlight had barely begun to filter through the cabin's grimy windows when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent ice through my veins. It was back. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I was on my feet, hand already on the cabin's rickety door handle. A quick glance out the window confirmed my worst fears. A massive, fur-covered silhouette prowling at the edge of the clearing. There was no time to think, no time to plan. I yanked the door open and ran. Adrenaline surged through me as I sprinted into the dark forest. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts, but I barely noticed. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and the monster behind me. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the trees, the cabin door being torn apart. Then came the pounding of heavy footfalls, gaining on me with terrifying speed. "No, no, no," I gasped, pushing myself harder. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but fear drove me forward. I ducked under low-hanging branches, leapt over fallen logs. The forest was a blur around me. My world narrowed to the path directly ahead, and the sounds of pursuit behind. Hot breath on my neck spurred me to run faster than I thought possible. It was right there, so close I could almost feel its claws reaching for me. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was futile. There was no one out here, no one to save me from this nightmare. A snarl so close it made my ears ring. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Yellow eyes gleamed with predatory intelligence. Massive jaws snapped inches from my back. In that split second of distraction, my foot caught on an exposed root. I stumbled, arms windmilling as I fought to keep my balance. It was all the opening the creature needed. Pain exploded across my back as claws raked through my coat. The force of the blow sent me tumbling forward. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. This is it, I thought, squeezing my eyes shut. This is how I die. But the killing blow never came. Instead, I heard a yelp of pain, followed by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. I opened my eyes, gasping for breath. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of the creature, shaking its head as if dazed. It had run full tilt into a low-hanging branch, buying me precious seconds. Ignoring the pain in my back, I scrambled to my feet and ran. Each step sent jolts of agony through me, but I pushed through it. I could hear the creature recovering, its growls growing louder as it resumed the chase. The forest seemed endless, trees blurred together, each path looking the same as the last. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond a way. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Please," I gasped, though I didn't know who or what I was pleading to. "Please, I don't want to die like this." I stumbled over hidden roots, each second feeling like it could be my last. The sound of pursuit grew closer, then faded, then grew close again. It was toying with me, I realized with horror. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a game. My foot caught on another root, and this time I couldn't catch myself. I went down hard, rolling down a small incline. Leaves and twigs stuck to my sweat-soaked skin as I came to a stop at the bottom. For a moment I lay there, every muscle screaming in protest. The temptation to just give up, to let whatever was going to happen, was overwhelming. But then I saw it. Barely visible through the trees, an old cabin loomed ahead. It was different from the one I'd sheltered in before, larger and somehow more solid-looking. It offered a slim chance of survival, and right now, that was all I had. With a groan of effort, I pushed myself to my feet. My legs felt like jelly, threatening to give out with each step, but I forced myself forward. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, closing the distance. The cabin grew larger as I approached, its weathered boards a beacon of hope in the gloom. 20 yards. 15. 10. A snarl ripped through the air, so close it made my ears ring. I could feel the creature's presence right behind me, could almost sense its claws reaching for my back. With a final burst of desperate energy, I hurled myself at the cabin door. My shoulder slammed into the wood, the impact jarring every bone in my body. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought it wouldn't give. Then, with a crack of splintering wood, the door flew open. I tumbled inside, my momentum carrying me across rough floorboards. Behind me, I heard a thud and an enraged howl. The creature had slammed into the doorframe, too large to fit through. Gasping for breath, I scrambled to my feet and threw my weight against the door. It groaned in protest but held. Outside, the monster snarled and scratched at the walls, searching for a way in. As the initial surge of adrenaline faded, the pain hit me full force. My back felt like it was on fire where the creature's claws had caught me. I could feel warm wetness seeping through what remained of my shredded coat. "Oh God," I whispered, sliding down to sit with my back against the door. "Oh God. Oh God. Oh God." The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd been chased, hunted, by something that shouldn't exist. Something that had nearly killed me, that might still kill me if it found a way into this cabin. Outside, the creature continued its assault on the building. Each impact made the walls shudder, dust raining down from the ceiling. I didn't know how long the old structure would hold. As I sat there, trembling and bleeding, one thought kept repeating in my mind. What am I going to do now? The sun climbed higher in the sky, its light filtering through cracks in the boarded-up windows. And still, the siege continued. I was trapped, injured, with no food, no water, and no way to call for help. I slammed the cabin door shut with all my remaining strength, the impact reverberating through my battered body. My hands fumbled with the rusty lock, desperately hoping the rotting wood would hold against the monster outside. "Please," I whispered, my voice hoarse from screaming and running. "Please let this be enough." For a moment there was silence. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear any sign of the creature. Had it given up? Had I finally lost it? Then a furious snarl shattered the quiet, so close it made me stumble backward. Claws raked across the outside of the door, the sound of splintering wood filling the air. The creature was trying to break in, and judging by the way the door shuddered, it might succeed. I scrambled away, my eyes darting around the dimly lit interior of the cabin. It was a single room, sparsely furnished with what looked like abandoned camping gear. A dusty sleeping bag lay in one corner. A few dented pots and pans scattered near a long, cold fireplace. Another impact shook the cabin, and I instinctively huddled in the far corner, putting as much distance between myself and the door as possible. My back screamed in protest as I pressed against the rough wooden wall, reminding me of the creature's earlier attack. I could feel warm blood still seeping from the wounds, but there was no time to examine them now. The assault on the door continued, each blow making the entire structure groan. I watched in horror as the wood began to bow inward, splinters flying with each impact. It was only a matter of time before it gave way completely. "This isn't happening," I muttered, squeezing my eyes shut. "This can't be real. Wake up, wake up, wake up." But when I opened my eyes, nothing had changed. The cabin was still shaking, the monster outside still howling for my blood. This nightmare was all too real. Hours seemed to pass, though my watch, miraculously still intact on my wrist, told me it had only been about 40 minutes. The attacks came in waves. Sometimes the creature would throw its full weight against the door or walls, making the whole cabin shudder. Other times, it would prowl around the perimeter, its growls and the sound of its heavy footsteps a constant reminder of the danger I was in. During one of the quieter moments, I forced myself to examine my injuries. My jacket was in tatters, the back shredded by the creature's claws. Gingerly, I peeled the fabric away from my skin, hissing at the pain. 4 parallel gashes ran diagonally across my back, from my right shoulder almost to my left hip. They were still bleeding, but not as heavily as before. "Okay," I said to myself, trying to stay calm. "Okay, you need to stop the bleeding. Think. What do you have?" I scanned the cabin again, this time with more purpose. There, near the fireplace, I spotted a faded first aid kit. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept over to it, always keeping one eye on the door. The kit was old, but it contained some gauze and antiseptic wipes. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I cleaned the wounds as best I could, biting my lip to keep from crying out at the sting. Then, with shaking hands, I pressed the gauze against my back, using strips of my ruined jacket to hold it in place. Just as I finished, another assault on the door made me jump. The creature howled, a sound of pure frustration and rage that chilled me to my core. I retreated to my corner, pulling the musty sleeping bag around me for what little comfort it could provide. And so the night wore on. The attacks came and went, sometimes so violent I was sure the cabin would collapse around me, other times fading to eerie silence that was almost worse. I didn't dare sleep, didn't dare take my eyes off the door for more than a few seconds at a time. In the darkness, my mind raced. What was this thing? How could it exist? And most pressingly, how was I going to survive until morning? If I make it through this, I promised myself, I'm never going camping again. Hell, I'm never leaving the city again. As the hours crawled by, I found myself talking out loud, if only to combat the oppressive silence between attacks. "Come on, son," I muttered, glancing at the boarded-up windows. "Any time now would be great. Don't these things always run away at dawn in the movies?" But dawn seemed an eternity away. My body ached, my wounds throbbed, and exhaustion pulled at me. Several times I caught myself nodding off, only to jerk awake at the slightest sound from outside. Finally, after what felt like days but my watch insisted was only about 6 hours, I noticed a change. The sky outside was lightening, the first gray hints of dawn seeping through the cracks in the boards. The creature seemed to notice too. Its attacks became more frenzied, more desperate. The door bowed inward alarmingly, wood creaking in protest. I pressed myself further into the corner, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Just a little longer," I whispered, eyes fixed on the steadily brightening windows. "Please, just hold on a little longer." As if in answer to my plea, the first true rays of sunlight began to filter through the cracks. Golden beams cut through the dusty air of the cabin, bringing with them a surge of hope. Outside, the creature let out one final ear-splitting howl. Then, abruptly, the attacks ceased. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound of movement. Nothing. Just the normal sounds of the forest awakening. I didn't move for a long time, too afraid to believe it was really over. When I finally gathered the courage to approach the door, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. Slowly, cautiously, I pressed my ear against the wood. No growls, no scratching, no heavy breathing, just silence. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and eased it open a crack. Sunlight streamed in, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, I peered out. The clearing was empty. No massive beast, no glowing eyes. Just an ordinary forest scene in the early morning light. The only signs of the night's events were deep claw marks in the door and walls of the cabin. I slumped against the door frame, a hysterical laugh bubbling up from my chest. I had survived. Somehow, against all odds, I had made it through the night. But as the adrenaline faded and the pain of my injuries reasserted itself, I realized my ordeal was far from over. I was injured, lost in the wilderness, with no supplies, and no idea how to get back to civilization. As I stood there, squinting in the morning sunlight, one thought crystallized in my mind. I had to get out of these woods, had to find help, before night fell again. Because if that thing came back, I knew I wouldn't survive a second encounter. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the cabin. It was time to find my way home, and pray that the horrors of the night were truly behind me. As the morning sun climbed higher, I finally gathered the courage to step outside the cabin. My legs trembled beneath me, every muscle aching from the night's ordeal. The forest seemed impossibly peaceful now, birds chirping and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. It was as if the horrors of the past hours had never happened. But they had. The evidence was all around me. I ran my hand along the cabin's exterior, feeling the deep gouges in the wood. Claw marks, unmistakably large and vicious, scored the walls. Some were so deep I could fit my entire hand into the grooves. My eyes followed the destruction, noting similar marks on nearby trees. It looked like the creature had vented its frustration on the entire clearing when it couldn't reach me. "Jesus," I muttered, my voice hoarse. What the hell could do this? I knew the answer, of course. I'd seen it with my own eyes, but my mind still rebelled against the impossibility of it all. A chill ran down my spine, and I hugged myself instinctively. The movement sent a jolt of pain through my back, reminding me of my injuries. I gingerly felt at the makeshift bandages. They were soaked through with blood, but the bleeding seemed to have slowed. My gaze fell on my shredded coat, hanging in tatters from my shoulders. It was the only tangible proof I had of my encounter. Everything else, the claw marks, my injuries, could potentially be explained away. But this was undeniable evidence of something large and vicious. I needed to get back to civilization, to find help. But which way? In the panic of the chase, I'd lost all sense of direction. After a moment's hesitation, I chose a direction that seemed to slope gently downhill. Water flows downhill, I reasoned, and where there's water, there's usually people. The journey was agonizing. Every step sent jolts of pain through my battered body. The forest, which had seemed so inviting when I first arrived, now felt oppressive. Every shadow made me flinch. Every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. I don't know how long I walked. Hours blurred together, marked only by the sun's slow arc across the sky. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard it, the distant sound of traffic. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I pushed forward, branches whipping at my face as I half ran, half stumbled toward the sound. Suddenly the trees thinned, and I found myself on the outskirts of a small town. The sign read, "Welcome to Pine Creek, Colorado. Population 2,187. I'd never been so happy to see civilization in my life. As I stumbled down the main street, my wild appearance drew concerned stares from passers-by. I must have looked a fright, clothes torn, covered in dirt and blood, wild-eyed with exhaustion and lingering fear. An elderly woman approached me cautiously. "Son, are you all right? Do you need help?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Now that I was safe, the full weight of what had happened crashed over me. I swayed on my feet, darkness creeping at the edges of my vision. The woman's eyes widened in alarm. "Someone call an ambulance," she shouted, reaching out to steady me. The next few minutes were a blur. I vaguely remember being guided to a bench, people clustering around me with worried expressions. Someone pressed a bottle of water into my hands, urging me to drink. Then, cutting through the concerned murmurs, an authoritative voice. "All right, folks, give him some space. I'll handle this." I looked up to see a man in a sheriff's uniform approaching. He crouched down in front of me, his expression a mix of concern and wariness. "I'm Sheriff Daniels," he said. "Can you tell me what happened to you, son?" I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. How could I possibly explain what I'd been through? I was camping, I began, my voice shaky, in the forest north of here. And then there was this thing, this creature. It attacked me. The sheriff's brow furrowed. "A creature? What kind of creature?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said with a bitter laugh. "Try me," he replied, his tone neutral. So I told him everything. The initial encounter at my campsite, the chase through the woods, the night of terror in the cabin. As I spoke, I could see the skepticism growing in his eyes. When I finished, there was a long silence. The sheriff stood up, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "That's quite a story," he said finally. "Now why don't you tell me what really happened?" My heart sank. "That is what really happened," I insisted. "I know it sounds crazy, but..." "Son," he cut me off, his tone gentle but firm. "We get a lot of campers through here. Sometimes they have too much to drink or eat some funny mushrooms they find in the woods. It's nothing to be ashamed of. But we need to know the truth to help you." "I'm not drunk or high," I said, frustration building. "Look at my coat. Look at these claw marks." I twisted, trying to show him my back. "Something attacked me." The sheriff held up a hand. All right. Let's get you checked out at the clinic. We can sort this all out once you've had some rest and medical attention." As he helped me to my feet, I realized with sinking dread that no one was ever going to believe what had happened to me. The claw marks could be explained away as a bear attack. My torn coat could have been damaged in a fall. And my wild story? The ramblings of a traumatized, possibly intoxicated camper. The truth of my ordeal would die here, dismissed as fantasy or hallucination. As the sheriff guided me toward a waiting ambulance, I felt utterly alone. The memory of those yellow eyes, that inhuman howl, would haunt only me. But at least I was alive. As I settled onto the gurney, exhaustion finally overtaking me, I made a silent vow. I would never set foot in those woods again. Whatever that thing was, whatever impossible horror I had encountered, I was leaving it behind. Or so I thought. The steady hum of the car engine did little to calm my frayed nerves as I made my way back to Denver. The doctor at the Pine Creek Clinic had patched me up, his expression a mixture of concern and disbelief as he tended to the claw marks on my back. He'd given me some painkillers and a tetanus shot, along with a stern recommendation to follow up with my regular physician. Sheriff Daniels had reluctantly let me go after taking my statement, though I could tell he didn't believe a word of it. Just be more careful next time you go camping, he'd said, his tone patronizing. The woods can play tricks on your mind. Now, as the miles of highway stretched before me, I found myself replaying the horrifying events on loop. The yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, the impossible speed and strength of the creature, the sound of its claws tearing through my jacket. I shook my head, trying to clear the images. Focus on the road, I muttered to myself. You're safe now. It's over. But was it? Every shadow on the highway seemed to morph into the creature's silhouette. A truck passing in the opposite lane made me flinch, its headlights momentarily reminding me of those glowing eyes. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Get it together, I hissed. You're hours away from those woods, it can't have followed you. Yet even as I said the words, doubt gnawed at me. How could I be sure? I didn't even know what it was. Some kind of wolf, a bear, or something else? Something that shouldn't exist outside of horror movies and campfire tales? The familiar skyline of Denver appeared on the horizon, bringing with it a wave of relief. Home, safety, normalcy. I clung to these concepts like a lifeline as I navigated the city streets. Pulling into my apartment complex's parking lot, I sat for a moment, gathering my courage. The urge to look over my shoulder was overwhelming. I felt exposed, vulnerable. This is ridiculous, I said aloud, forcing myself to exit the car. You're in the middle of the city, there are people everywhere, you're safe. But the reassurances rang hollow as I hurried to my building, keys clutched tightly in my hand. Every rustle of leaves, every distant car horn made me jump. Once inside my apartment, I immediately locked the door behind me. Then, driven by an irrational but overwhelming fear, I went through the entire place, checking and double-checking every window, every possible entry point. There, I said, collapsing onto my couch. No way in, you're safe. But sleep eluded me. Every creak of the building, every distant siren had me sitting bolt upright, convinced that somehow impossibly the monster had followed me, had found me. At one point, a cat yowled somewhere outside, and I nearly leapt out of my skin. Heart pounding, I pressed myself into the corner of the couch, eyes darting wildly around the room. It's just a cat, I whispered, trying to slow my breathing. Just a normal, ordinary cat. Not that thing. But what if it wasn't? What if that creature, whatever it was, had some way of tracking me? What if right now it was out there, prowling the city streets, searching for its escaped prey? I shook my head violently. Stop it, I growled. You're being paranoid. It was just a wolf, or a bear. Something normal, something explainable. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. What I had encountered in those woods was far from normal. Those eyes, that impossible speed and strength, it defied explanation. As the hours crept by, I found myself alternating between moments of exhausted near sleep and jolting, heart-pounding wakefulness. Every time I started to drift off, my mind would conjure images of yellow eyes and gleaming fangs, jerking me back to alertness. I turned on every light in the apartment, unable to bear the shadows. They seemed to move, to shift in ways that shadows shouldn't. More than once, I caught myself staring at a dark corner, convinced I'd seen something move. You're losing it, I muttered, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes. Get a grip. But how could I? How was I supposed to just go back to normal life after what I'd experienced? The rational part of my brain insisted it had all been some kind of hallucination. Stress, exhaustion, maybe even a bad reaction to some wild mushrooms I'd accidentally ingested. But the rest of me, the primal part that had run for my life through those dark woods, knew better. As dawn finally broke, painting my apartment in soft golden light, I found myself wondering if I was losing my grip on reality. Had it all really happened? The claw marks on my back said yes, but everything else? It seemed impossible in the light of day. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. The person staring back at me from the mirror looked like a stranger, pale, wide-eyed, with dark circles under my eyes and a wild, haunted look. "Pull yourself together," I told my reflection sternly. "It's over. You're home. Safe. It was just a crazy thing that happened. Time to move on." But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever I had encountered, it had changed me. The world suddenly seemed darker, more dangerous, full of shadows that might hide things that shouldn't exist. As I turned away from the mirror, a sudden movement outside my window caught my eye. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, barely daring to breathe, I approached the window. There, on the street below, a large dog was trotting along the sidewalk, its owner not far behind. Just a normal, everyday sight. Nothing to be afraid of. But for a moment, just a split second, I could have sworn those weren't a dog's eyes looking up at my window. They were yellow, intelligent, hungry. I stumbled back, yanking the curtains closed. "It's not real," I gasped, sliding down to sit on the floor. "It can't be real. It can't have followed me. It can't." But as I sat there trembling, I realized that whether it was real or not didn't matter. The fear was real. The memory was real. And somehow I knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever had started in those woods, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The soft glow of my computer screen illuminated my haggard face as I scrolled through yet another website filled with werewolf lore. It had been 2 days since my return from the forest, and sleep had become a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, those yellow orbs stared back at me from the darkness. "This is insane," I muttered, rubbing my tired eyes. "Werewolves aren't real. They can't be." And yet here I was, poring over ancient myths and legends, desperate for any information that might explain what I had encountered. Silver bullets, full moons, curses. It all seemed so ridiculous in the light of day. But then again, so did a massive wolf-like creature chasing me through the woods. A news alert on my phone drew my attention away from the fantastical tales. My heart nearly stopped as I read the headline. "Search continues for missing hikers in Colorado wilderness." With trembling hands, I opened the article. 2 hikers, last seen in the same area where I had camped, had vanished without a trace. The search had been going on for 3 days now, with no signs of the missing pair. "Oh God," I whispered, a chill running down my spine. Could it be? Had that thing gotten to them too? I shook my head, trying to clear the horrifying images that flooded my mind. This was crazy. I needed to talk to someone who might actually believe me. After another hour of frantic searching, I found what I was looking for. Dr. Elena Kostova, cryptozoologist. Her website claimed she studied animals unknown to science. It was a long shot, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. The next morning, I found myself in a cluttered office surrounded by books, maps, and what looked like plaster casts of large footprints. Dr. Kostova, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently as I recounted my experience. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "That's quite a story, Mr. Johnson," she said. "I've heard many accounts of cryptid encounters over the years, but yours is unique." "Then you believe me?" I asked, hope rising in my chest. She held up a hand. "I believe that you believe what you saw, and your injuries certainly suggest an encounter with a large predator. But a werewolf?" She shook her head. "I'm afraid I can't offer you any concrete explanations." My heart sank. But the size, the speed, the intelligence in its eyes, it wasn't like any normal animal. "The human mind is a powerful thing," Dr. Kostova said gently. "Under extreme stress, it can play tricks on us, make us see things that aren't there." "So you think I'm crazy?" I said flatly. "Not at all," she replied. "I think you had a traumatic experience with a large predator, possibly a bear or a wolf. The rest, well, fear can make our imaginations run wild." I left her office feeling more lost than ever. Part of me wanted to believe her rational explanation, to dismiss the whole thing as a case of an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. That night, the nightmares came again. I was back in the forest, running for my life. But this time, no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. Those yellow eyes grew closer and closer until I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. As I sat there in the darkness trying to calm my racing heart, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if Dr. Kostova was right? What if my mind was playing tricks on me? The next morning I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing the person looking back at me. Dark circles under my eyes, a wild, haunted look. I looked like a man on the edge. Maybe I am losing it, I said to my reflection. Maybe this is all just stress, a breakdown. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The claw marks on my back, still healing, were a constant reminder that what I had experienced was all too real. As I made my way to the kitchen for yet another cup of coffee, my phone buzzed with a news alert. My blood ran cold as I read the headline. Hiker found dead in Colorado wilderness, animal attack suspected. The article was light on details, but one line stood out. Injuries consistent with a large predator, possibly a bear or wolf. I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. It couldn't be a coincidence. Whatever I had encountered in those woods was still out there, still hunting. In that moment, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't just forget about what had happened. I couldn't pretend it was all in my head. Because if I did, if I ignored the truth of what I had seen, more people might die. As I sat there, staring at the news article, a resolve began to form. I might not have any concrete proof, might not even fully understand what I was up against. But I knew one thing for certain. I had to do something. I had to find a way to stop this creature before it claimed any more victims. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone and dialed Dr. Kostova's number. When she answered, I took a deep breath. Dr. Kostova, it's Mark Johnson. I need your help. I think there's something out there, something dangerous, and I think I might be the only one who can stop it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, finally, she spoke. Mr. Johnson, I think you'd better come back to my office. We have a lot to discuss. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mix of fear and determination wash over me. Whatever lay ahead, whatever impossible truths I might uncover, I knew there was no turning back now. The hunt was on. The calendar on my kitchen wall seemed to mock me. The approaching full moon circled in angry red ink. It had been nearly a month since my encounter in the woods, but the terror remained fresh, a constant companion that whispered dark possibilities in my ear. As the day of the full moon drew nearer, an inexplicable dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to rationalize it away. I was in the city, far from those dark woods. I was safe. And yet, this is ridiculous, I muttered to myself, pacing my small apartment. You're acting crazy. It's just the moon. It doesn't mean anything. But even as I said the words, I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows for the third time that hour. The rational part of my brain screamed that I was being paranoid, but a deeper, more primal part whispered that caution was the only thing keeping me alive. As night fell on the eve of the full moon, I made my decision. I couldn't take any chances. I began to barricade myself in, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. My neighbors would think I'd lost my mind if they could see me, but I didn't care. All that mattered was keeping that thing out. If it even exists, I said aloud, trying to inject some skepticism into my voice, but the tremor in my words betrayed my true feelings. I settled into an armchair facing the main window, a baseball bat clutched in my sweaty hands. The city lights twinkled beyond the glass, a reminder of the normal world that seemed so far away now. Hours crept by. The street below was quiet, the occasional passing car the only sign of life. I felt my eyelids growing heavy, the lack of sleep from the past month catching up with me. Just as I was about to drift off, a sound cut through the night, a howl, long and mournful. My eyes snapped open, every muscle in my body tensing. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse with fear. "No, it can't be." The howl came again, closer this time. Too close. It didn't sound like a dog or a coyote. It was deeper, more guttural, familiar in a way that sent ice through my veins. I pressed myself deeper into the chair, eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to move, to twist into menacing shapes. Every creak of the building, every distant siren became the footsteps of an approaching monster. "It's not real," I muttered, a mantra I'd repeated countless times over the past month. "It can't be here. It's all in your head." But then I heard it, a scratching sound at my window. Soft at first, then more insistent. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned my head toward the sound. Through a gap in the blinds, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows below. Something large. A whimper escaped my lips as I pressed myself as far back into the chair as I could go. The scratching continued, accompanied now by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. "This isn't happening," I gasped, squeezing my eyes shut. "Wake up, wake up, wake up." But when I opened my eyes, nothing had changed. The scratching continued, more frantic now. I could hear the window frame creaking under some immense pressure. In that moment, terror overwhelmed me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room spun around me as I gasped for air, my vision tunneling. I was dimly aware that I was having a panic attack, but I was powerless to stop it. As I struggled to regain control, a new sound cut through the chaos, the sharp crack of breaking wood. My eyes snapped to the window just in time to see a massive clawed hand burst through the blinds. I screamed then, a sound of pure primal terror. Adrenaline surged through me, temporarily overriding my panic. I leapt from the chair, the baseball bat clattering forgotten to the floor. I ran for the bedroom, slamming the door behind me and wedging a chair under the handle. The sounds from the living room were deafening now, shattering glass, splintering wood, and over it all, that bone-chilling growl. As I huddled in the corner of my bedroom, phone clutched in my shaking hands as I tried to dial 911, a horrible realization washed over me. Even if the police came, what could they do? They wouldn't believe me. No one had believed me. And by the time they arrived, it might be too late. The bedroom door shuddered under a heavy impact. Once, twice. On the third blow, I heard the wood begin to splinter. In that moment, as I stared at the slowly disintegrating door, I knew that this was it. The encounter in the woods hadn't been a one-time thing, a random act of nature. This creature, this impossible monster, had hunted me down. It had crossed miles of wilderness and city to find me. And now, as the full moon shone bright and mocking through my bedroom window, I realized that my nightmare was far from over. It was only just beginning. The door gave way with a final, thunderous crack. As splinters flew across the room, I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness beyond. The same eyes that had haunted my dreams for the past month. The eyes of a predator that had found its prey. As the massive shape began to push its way into the room, I did the only thing I could. I screamed, praying that someone, anyone, would hear me. But as the creature's snarling face came into view, I knew that even if help was coming, it would be too late. The hunt that had begun in those dark woods was about to reach its brutal conclusion. And as those yellow eyes fixed on me with terrifying intelligence, I realized that this was only the beginning of a horror that would consume not just me, but perhaps the entire city. The city had fallen into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant wail of sirens and the pounding of my own heart. I stood in my kitchen, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sign of the creature's approach. The memory of those yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness of my bedroom still burned in my mind, even though hours had passed since its sudden retreat. A sharp metallic clang from outside made me jump. The fire escape. Something was climbing up, each rattle of the old metal structure sending a fresh wave of terror through me. It was coming back. "No, no, no," I whispered, backing away from the window. My eyes darted around the kitchen, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. They landed on the knife block, and without thinking, I grabbed the largest one. The cold steel of the handle did little to comfort me as I gripped it tightly. I knew deep down that it would be useless against the monster I remembered. But it was all I had. The rattling grew louder, closer. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing now, punctuated by low, rumbling growls that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of my apartment. "Please," I murmured, though I didn't know who or what I was pleading with. "Please, not again." But my prayers went unanswered. With a deafening crash, the window exploded inward, showering the kitchen floor with glittering shards of glass. And there, framed in the jagged opening, was the stuff of my nightmares. It was exactly as I remembered from that terrifying night in the woods. Massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a horrifying blend of man and wolf. Coarse, dark fur covered its muscular frame, and its hands ended in razor-sharp claws that had left deep gouges in the window frame. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me with fear. Yellow, glowing with an unnatural intelligence, and a hunger that turned my blood to ice. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other. Then, with a snarl that exposed gleaming fangs, it lunged. Instinct took over. I slashed wildly with the knife, feeling a moment of resistance as it connected with flesh. The creature let out a roar of pain and fury, and I saw a line of dark blood appear on its chest. But my small victory was short-lived. With speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so large, it swung one massive arm. The blow caught me in the side, lifting me off my feet and sending me crashing into the kitchen counter. Pain exploded through my body, and for a moment my vision went dark. I could taste blood in my mouth, and every breath sent daggers of agony through my ribs. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was futile. Who would believe me? Who could possibly help against something like this? The creature advanced, its yellow eyes fixed on me with predatory focus. I tried to scramble away, my hand searching blindly for the knife I'd dropped. Just as I felt my fingers close around the handle, a new sound cut through the chaos. Sirens much closer now. Blue and red lights began to flash outside, illuminating the creature in strobing bursts. The effect on the monster was immediate. Its head snapped toward the window, ears flattening against its skull. For a moment it seemed torn between its prey, me, and the threat of discovery. Then, with a final bone-chilling growl, it turned and leaped back out the shattered window. I heard the fire escape rattle once more, then silence. I lay there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by broken glass and spattered blood, both mine and the creature's. My entire body ached, and I could feel warm blood trickling down my side where the monster's claws had caught me. The sound of pounding footsteps in the hallway outside barely registered. When my apartment door burst open, revealing 2 police officers with guns drawn, I could only stare at them in numb disbelief. "Sir, are you all right?" "You?" one of them asked, his eyes widening as he took in the scene of destruction. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain what had happened? They'd never believe me. As the officers called for medical assistance and began to secure the scene, I found myself drifting. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me shaky and lightheaded. "Sir, can you tell us what happened here?" the second officer asked, crouching down beside me. I looked at him, then at the shattered window. In the distance, I could hear the approaching wail of an ambulance. I was attacked, I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "By who? Did you see them?" I hesitated. The truth hovered on the tip of my tongue, but I knew how it would sound. I'd be dismissed as crazy, traumatized, or worse. I'm not sure, I said finally. It happened so fast. It was big and strong. The officer nodded sympathetically. Don't worry, sir. We'll figure this out. The ambulance is almost here. Just try to stay calm. But as I lay there, waiting for the paramedics, I knew that no amount of police investigation would uncover the truth. The creature had vanished into the night, leaving behind only destruction and my own unbelievable story. And yet, as the first rays of dawn began to peek through the broken window, a new thought occurred to me. The knife. I had wounded it. For the first time, I had proof. Real, physical evidence that the monster was more than just a figment of my imagination. As the paramedics arrived and began to assess my injuries, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to prove what I had seen, what I had experienced. Because if I didn't, if I let this creature continue to hunt unchecked, how many more would suffer the same fate? The hunt had taken an unexpected turn. Now, I realized, I was no longer just the prey. I had become the hunter as well. The flashing red and blue lights painted surreal patterns on my apartment walls as I sat on the edge of my bed, a blanket draped over my shoulders. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving me feeling hollow and numb. Police officers moved through my shattered living space, their voices a low murmur as they documented the destruction. Mr. Johnson? A detective approached, notepad in hand. I'm Detective Ramirez. Can you walk me through what happened here tonight? I looked up at her, my mind racing. How could I possibly explain the truth? The creature, the impossible horror I'd faced not once, but twice now. I was asleep, I began, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. I heard a crash. When I came out to investigate, something was in my apartment. Detective Ramirez's eyebrow raised slightly at my choice of words. Something? I backpedaled quickly. Someone. It was dark, I couldn't see clearly. They were big, though, strong. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen to defend myself. The knife we found with blood on it? She asked. I nodded, a spark of hope igniting in my chest. The blood. Finally, proof that I wasn't crazy. Yeah, I think I managed to cut them. I corrected myself hastily. Detective Ramirez made a note, her expression neutral. We'll have the lab analyze the blood. It should help us identify your attacker. As she walked away, I overheard one of the officers near the shattered window. Jesus, look at these claw marks. What the hell could have done this? Bear, maybe? His partner suggested. Remember that one that got into the suburbs last year? In a fifth-floor apartment? No way, man, this is weird. Their conversation was cut short as a crime scene technician approached with a sample kit. Hours passed in a blur of questions, photographs, and evidence collection. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across my ruined apartment, Detective Ramirez returned. Mr. Johnson, we've completed our initial investigation. There's no sign of forced entry besides the broken window, and no fingerprints besides your own. But the blood, I interrupted, desperation creeping into my voice. On the knife. That proves something was here, right? She hesitated, and I felt my heart sink. The preliminary tests show it's animal blood. We'll need to run more specific tests to determine the species, but... Animal blood? I echoed, disbelief coloring my tone. That's impossible. I saw it, I fought it. Detective Ramirez's expression softened slightly. Mr. Johnson, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes, in high-stress situations, our minds can play tricks on us. I'm not crazy, I insisted, anger flaring. It was here, it was real. I'm not saying you're crazy, she said calmly. But the evidence doesn't support an intruder. No prints, no DNA besides the animal blood. The damage is extensive, but what? I demanded. She sighed. But it's consistent with someone in a panicked state causing damage themselves. We see it sometimes in cases of night terrors or sleepwalking. I stared at her, speechless. They thought I had done this? That I had destroyed my own apartment in some sort of delusional fit? We'll file this as a break-in attempt for now, Detective Ramirez continued. I'd recommend you stay with a friend or family member until your apartment can be secured, and perhaps consider speaking with someone about what you've been through. Trauma can manifest in unexpected ways. As the police finally left, I stood in the middle of my wrecked living room, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The morning sun streamed through the broken window, illuminating the destruction that surrounded me. Claw marks scored the walls and furniture, glass crunched under my feet, and dark stains, blood, both mine and the creature's, marred the floor. But to everyone else, it was just the aftermath of a break-in. A random act of violence, or worse, the result of my own mental breakdown. Weeks passed, and life somehow went on. I moved to a new apartment, unable to bear the memories that haunted every corner of my old place. I went through the motions of normalcy, work, social interactions, daily routines. But beneath it all, a constant undercurrent of fear and hyper-vigilance plagued me. Every shadow on the street made me flinch. Every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. And always, the knowledge that the creature was still out there gnawed at me. I tried to research, to find any information that might help me understand what I had encountered. But every lead ended in frustration. Myths, legends, Hollywood fabrications, nothing that could explain the very real, very dangerous creature I had faced. Sleep became my enemy. Nightmares haunted me nightly, vivid recreations of those terrifying encounters. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of inhuman growls ringing in my ears. "You look like hell, Mark," my coworker Sarah commented one morning. "Are you sure you're okay?" I forced a smile, knowing how haggard I must appear. "Just not sleeping well," I replied, the understatement of the century. "Is it because of the break-in?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Have you thought about talking to someone? There's no shame in seeking help after something like that." I nodded absently, the familiar frustration bubbling up. How could I explain that it wasn't the break-in that haunted me, but the knowledge that a monster, a real flesh and blood monster, was out there? As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I found myself wondering if this was to be my life now. Always waiting, always watching, never knowing when or if I'd encounter the werewolf again. The police report labeled it a break-in. The world moved on. But I was trapped in a nightmare that refused to end.